This is Just Ask Julia, and it's a monthly call that we have to share tips, trends, insights, resources, anything that will help you transform your career and elevate your success. I am going to actually hand it over to my colleague, Liz Helton, who has this great workshop for you today on the do's and don'ts of your resume. So, Liz, take it away.
All right. Well, good morning, everybody. My name is Liz Helton, and for this installment of Just Ask Julia, we are going to be covering some really important resume do's and don'ts. So, for those of you watching live today, we're going to go through our presentation, and we're gonna talk about some really key important things to keep in mind for your resume. At the end of today's presentation, we're going to have some great time for Q&A, where you can ask us all about resumes, cover letters, LinkedIn, anything career development related. If you're watching this on the replay on our YouTube, make sure to click the link below so that you can check out the next installment. We do this the first Friday of every month, 9 a.m. Pacific time, and we hope that you can join us sometime soon. So kicking off today, we're going to talk about maximizing the effectiveness of your resume in 2024. But before we dive into the nuts and bolts of your resume, we're going to talk a little bit about today's job market, because in where we're at right now, May of 2024, things are a little bit wild and complicated. I Every single day I have people say to me, Liz, the job market, unemployment numbers don't necessarily match up with what I'm feeling. I hear so often that clients are saying, I am like submitting my resume and it feels like I'm shouting into a void. I've submitted hundreds of applications and things are just absolutely wild. Well, the numbers are a little misleading right now, because a 3.8, 3.9 is where we're sitting on unemployment. That number doesn't tell the whole story. That number is not taking into account the incredible number of people who are currently facing underemployment, which is a metric that's really hard to gauge. It's also not taking into account people who are maybe not tapping into that unemployment benefits package, or have run out of their unemployment package. What we really are seeing right now are job search struggles that are comparable to what we faced back in 2008, and maybe even more complex than that. So in this job market, it's really important to be looking at how you're tackling your personal brand through your resume. Now, we're going to talk all about resume today, but I'm here to tell you that a great resume is just the first step. A click and submit strategy with your job search is not going to cut it in this job market. So at the very end, we are going to talk about some other things you want to keep in mind to help amplify the visibility of your resume. Everything that we're going to talk about today is going to help you have the best resume possible. But it is important that you are also taking a very networking based approach with your job search right now. And some of what we're going to talk about today is going to help with that. As we start talking through the resume, what we're going to do today is we're going to kind of go top to bottom on resume and look at some don'ts and some do's. So let's get started. First and foremost, let's look at the overall format of your resume and the letterhead. I see this all the time. The beautifully formatted side panel, pretty design that looks great and showcases like an aesthetic for sure. However, this is not an effective resume for a lot of reasons. First and foremost, this resume is not going to be applicant tracking system compliant, because it oftentimes uses text boxes which will flatten your text into an image. And these applicant tracking systems, or the robots that read resumes before humans do, they can't read text boxes. They can't read an image. So oftentimes that information is going to get jumbled. It also will include heavy table usage, and applicant tracking systems, the way they read tables, they're going to read it like they're reading the page of a document. So they're going to read kind of from left to right. So if you don't have your content lined up in a certain way, it's going to misorganize where things are supposed to go. So oftentimes these systems will look at a resume like this and not know what to do with it. And it could automatically bounce you from a system before you even have a shot at telling your story. Secondly, we don't want to pack our resume with a ton of different fonts. Now, this one doesn't have too many, but I often see versions look similar to this, where maybe Isabel's name is going to be in like a great like script font that looks really beautiful. These systems don't love heavy font. Humans don't love to read multiple fonts in their resume. You really want to stick to kind of one format, one font. I'm going to show you an example of what that looks like in a moment. Secondly, for those applying in the United States specifically, we do not use our photo on our resume. In other countries, yes, absolutely, having your image is actually required. I know countries like Germany, for instance, it's actually a requirement. Here in the US, it's not what we look for. That's what your LinkedIn profile is for. Throughout the overall vibe of your resume, we want to stay away from that first person language, right? We want to keep those personal pronouns out of the picture. We want to really stick to some very straightforward, known for accomplishing X, Y, and Z. The language, while it can feel a little bit more robotic, is going to keep the tone very neutral, because you want to remember whoever's reading your resume doesn't know your voice yet, right? They're reading it in their own assumption of who you are. So when you include things like personal pronouns, you're putting a tone into their head that might come off as self-centered perhaps, or overly with an extra amount of ego. Keeping those pronouns out of it will kind of neutralize your tone a little bit. And lastly, as you can see at the bottom of this resume, they have a reference list. We want to keep those references out of there. When your future employer wants those references, they're going to ask for them. So you just don't need to include them on your resume. Secondly, the other type of formatting challenge I see is kind of on the other end of the spectrum, is the absolutely outdated format that has kind of just a very strict, old school serif font that is, the Times New Roman, and has this, objective and soft skills and the extra white space, because again, they're using a table to put kind of the categories on the left, and then the bullet points on the right. Now, this resume, I actually would say would be applicant tracking system compliant. But remember, that's not the only thing that we're writing to, right? We're writing it for all stages of the hiring process. So yes, will applicant tracking system be able to read this resume? Sure, but look how much white space is left on that left side. That is so much room that you could be using for great content, okay? So instead, what we wanna do is we wanna use a really strong text-based format. And yes, you can absolutely incorporate some strategic color into your resume that is going to help move the eye down the page, right? We want to make sure that we have control over how the reader is taking in information, because at the end of the day, you have about 6 seconds before somebody is going to decide what they're going to do with your resume. Now, that's not the amount of time your resume gets read overall, but somebody's going to make a first impression about you in that first 6 seconds. And we want to make sure they get as much information as possible. Which is why the second thing you want to do when you're formatting and figuring out the structure of your resume is to use an inverted pyramid style. Now, this is a resume for more of an entry-level candidate. So you'll see the education portion is really high up there, right? Because at the time that we had put this together, this individual hadn't even graduated yet. However, the reason it's up high is because that's the biggest, most important accomplishment that she has to date. As she goes through her career, she's going to be talking a lot more about those experiences that she has in her professional life, and that education is going to become a nice footnote. So when you're structuring your resume, it's really important to think about what is the information they need to have first and foremost, right? As you can see here, we've switched to a sans serif font, meaning it doesn't have those little tails. Actually, the formatting and letterhead title that we have on this slide is a great example of a serif font. We really like to stick to a sans serif font on a resume, because by and large, resumes now are being read on a screen. So you want the bulk of your text to be in that sans serif font, because reading on a screen tends to be a little bit easier with that sans serif. You'll notice most websites typically use a sans serif font, and there's a reason for that. Additionally, unlike our previous versions, we don't want to include our full address. We instead just want to include our email, our phone number, and the LinkedIn profile. This is so important. 34% of recruiters say they will disregard a candidate that they can't find on LinkedIn. Make it as easy as possible for them. We also want to give ourselves a title, or kind of showcase right up at the top what your industry expertise is, right? Connect your name to what it is that you're targeting, right? Now, you want to make sure that that title is very much connected to the experience you already have, but also aligns you with that current role. So find what that line of connection really is. So for this individual, she was very much going after PR positions. And yeah, she's still a student, but she has had roles and internships that can qualify her as a PR professional. We want to be consistent with our spacing throughout the entire document. You'll see here that we've got a justified margin on both sides. We really like on a resume to have a justified margin because that gives a clean line all the way down. And hiring managers and recruiters oftentimes will pick up on spacing inconsistencies, and they can be a little bit distracting. And then overall, we really want to stick to the length that's going to be important for or valid for how long your experience is. So a 2-page resume is not out of the question if you've had between, 8 to 10 years experience or more, right? If you're still in your first or second job, we want to really make sure that we're sticking to that 1-page version of your story. But as you grow and progress through your career, it's going to be hard to tell your whole story in one single 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper. So it will be okay to expand that story out a little bit. Now, we're going to kind of take a journey with moving forward with a specific candidate that we're going to look at some things that we can do to kind of improve their resume. So we're going to go section by section now and talk about how to improve a specific resume so you can kind of get a sense of a before and after. Let's talk about the introduction. So we're going to work with Pam Beasley. She's decided she wants to leave the paper business, and we're going to get into exactly what it is that she's targeting here in just a moment. But when it comes to the introduction, everything that comes before you start diving into your experience, you want to make sure that you are giving the reader an opportunity to really get to know you. I like to think of this as the hallway test. Imagine a hiring manager is printing out your resume for the first time and reading through your resume, and they have essentially the length of a hallway from their desk to the room they're interviewing you in to really remember who you are, what you're all about, and to take in some information so they can kick off your conversation. We want to maximize that hallway length of time for them to take in that amount of information so that they can know what you're all about and what they can focus their conversation on. So as you can see here, again, we've got that kind of boring old school template, but what we start off with is Pam's objective, what she's looking for. It's pretty apparent she's applied for this job, so it's kind of hopeful that it would be in line with her objective. Objective statements were something that were used prior to, the innovation of the internet, when we would have to kind of like package our resumes up and really let people know what they were reaching out for, right? Nowadays, it's apparent why you're applying for a specific job. So instead, what we're going to look at next is how to turn this into more of a summary statement that calls out your expertise. You also want to make sure when we're talking about your core expertise that we're not focusing on soft skills, right? We're not talking about how you're a collaborator and a team player and that you know the remedial skills of Office and Zoom. Spoiler, Office and Zoom are no longer technical skill sets because everybody from my second grader all the way up to his grandparents knows how to use it at this point, right? You can't get to the point you're at in your career without knowing these things. Being detail oriented or deadline driven. This is kind of an expectation. It's kind of well, I would certainly hope so that you're all of these things. You want to be able to prove how you are all of these things by talking about the expertise that you have and the accomplishments that you've made throughout your career. Right? And most importantly, we don't want to make claims that we can't back up, right? So instead, what we want to do is we want to create something that is more of a personal brand introduction. All right, so you'll see right at the top, we have a very aligned summary that doesn't show just what Pam wants to do, but it shows what she's great at and why they should be paying attention. And now we can also see what Pam's actually going for, that she is a senior service delivery partner in IT leadership, right? And right underneath this, we have almost like a tagline, a bold statement that kind of differentiates her, right? What does she do? She leads infrastructure operations to streamline and reduce costs while improving quality and customer service. Okay, Pam, I'm paying attention now. Right? And this summary is really going to dive into what experiences she has and how she has kind of demonstrated who she is as a professional. Now, moving into that core expertise, you'll see we no longer talk about how she gets along with people at work. We're talking about the things that she knows how to do. Now, the core expertise section, also known as core skills or core competencies, has kind of come in and out of favor over time. But right now, in the job market that we're in, it's really important to have this quick snapshot so that somebody can kind of scan through your resume and quickly see, yep, check the boxes. And these are all words that you should be able to find in that job description. You should be able to do a control find in the job description and find each of these terms in one form or another. When recruiters are looking at applications, oftentimes the words that are most important to them are going to get bolded out, right? We see this prevalent on LinkedIn Recruiter. It's very similar depending on the system. There's over 100 systems out there, so it's hard to explain each and every nuance of all of them. But unifying theme is that an applicant tracking system is going to look for candidates based on the words they have in their resume in alignment with the words that are in the job description. So go through and update this core expertise based on every single role that you apply to. A lot of them are going to be the same if you're going after the same type of role, but more or less what you're going to be able to do is kind of update and reprioritize based on what the role is. This example doesn't have this, but we do want critical technical competencies. I like to list them out in a separate space, kind of right underneath. And when I say technical competencies, I'm talking software, systems, platforms, things like, SQL or Tableau, Salesforce, Cision, like these, depending on your industries and what it is that you do, these are words that might resonate with some of you. But these are the technical things that relate to the work that you do, right? And it's going to be something that is very specific and oftentimes called out in the job description. Now, for those of you who have a little bit more experience under your belt, right? This next piece does not relate to those who have less than 8 to 10 years of experience. But for those who have a little bit more experience, you might want to consider, and I really advocate for considering, a career highlight section in your introduction. 3 to 4 bullet points that call out the most important anchor points of your career, things that are going to immediately back up the statements that you have just made. I want this highlight section to be so crystal clear that if that person, the person you're talking to, only has a second to just read those 3 to 4 points, they're still going to have some really good insight to your accomplishments and have a great conversation with you. So this is a great, once we go top to bottom in this introduction, the renewed version of it should almost serve like a Cliff Notes version of your entire resume, right? This is a great way for somebody to get to know you in a really quick and easy way. And a lot of times people say, well, Liz, is this all that I need to submit for? Like, can I just use this as my resume? Sometimes what we do is we have maybe an expanded 1-pager for some clients to have as a supplementary document. But what we're still finding is that the expanded full story with all of your professional expertise is going to be really critical in the formalities of how recruiters, hiring managers are looking through your overall expertise. So it is great to have this expanded introduction to serve not just in that in submission phase, but across the board, because your resume serves a lot of different purposes, from the applicant tracking phase to how the hiring manager or recruiter is going to look at it, to how they're going to sit and talk about the interview you just had, right? And reflect back on the conversation you just had. The introduction portion of your resume is going to be a great way to capture attention at all stages of that life cycle. Okay. Let's move on to that next section. The meat and potatoes of your resume, the professional experience. Okay. Now, one of the biggest things that I see over and over and over again is that we will find a series of job descriptions, right? Or something that just describes what the scope of the role has been, right? Instead, what we want to do, we're going to focus on kind of shifting over to impact. So first and foremost, don't just describe your work, right? We don't want to just give the scope of what we talk about. We want to talk about not what you do, but how well you do it, right? We don't want to overwhelm with too much information or information they just don't need. You'll see in Pam's first bullet here, she says, held meetings related to transitioning the company's managed services ahead of schedule. All right, I see just a glimmer of hope ahead of schedule, right? That's something that's going to lead us toward impact. But holding meetings, Damn, everybody has meetings. We have too many meetings oftentimes. We don't need to know that you've been to meetings. We also don't want to go back, as I had said earlier, over 15 years, right? In that professional experience section, we're really focusing on the last 10 to 15 years max. I'm going to show you some things that you can do for those who maybe have earlier experiences that they still want to speak to, but maybe are not as relevant now as they were at one point. We'll get to that in just a moment. All right, so instead, how can we amplify the experience? Well, first and foremost, we want to really separate out the description of the role from the accomplishments. So right out of the gate, you can see that we've got the kind of introduction of what the role was all about, right? That's largely what we saw in those previous bullet points. But then what we're going to do is these bullets are so specific. We are writing these bullets to showcase so specifically the accomplishment and the impact that Pam has had throughout her career, right? So a great way to format this, if you're struggling to figure out how to write a bullet for your resume, think accomplished X as measured by Y by doing Z, right? So accomplished X as measured by Y by doing Z. And it might not always land, sentence structure might not always make sense to put it in that order. It might end up being ZYX. What we do find though, is that especially in the tech world, there was actually an article in, I think it was Forbes, from a Google recruiter who said that the XYZ format for structuring your bullets is the most effective way to capture the hiring decision makers' attention, because it's putting the metric, the impact up front, right? So as much as you can, quantify, and I'm also going to say, or qualify your impact. I know a lot of times people say, but I'm not measured on like a percent increase. Oftentimes, say in compliance, for example, oftentimes the job is not about making an increase, it's preventing things from happening. That's okay too. That is impact, right? So don't limit yourself to just thinking about the quantified impact. Also think about the qualified impact. Lastly, we also want to make sure that we're writing to the target audience, right? Make sure that you're using the language and structuring your accomplishments toward the type of role that you're targeting. You might be considering a pivot in your career from maybe sales to customer service, right? That's something incremental, right? But how you're shaping and measuring your impact is going to tell the reader why you're great for that job. Remember that you're not writing this document just as a measurement of who you are as a professional. It's a measurement of who you are in relation to the role you're applying to. So make sure when you're writing this, you're really thinking about your accomplishments in terms of, you know, what the individual is going to care about. So go back to that job description and really look and say, what do they need to know about my experience? What are the transferable skills that I need to be focusing on and maybe tweaking around a little bit? All right. And lastly, let's get down to the bottom, the nice to have portion of your resume that are still important information to have, but not necessarily as critical as the other pieces. So we call these the additional sections. First and foremost, what we don't want to do or include things like the dates of your education. If you have been out of school for 5 or more years, definitely not. You can start to remove that education graduation date after you've had those first couple jobs, right? Because at the end of the day, ageism is real. It works in both ways. You're either too old or too young. Nobody is ever the right age. And the dates of your education are the first clue to someone as to how old you are. So unless specifically asked for, we do not need to include the education dates. You also don't need to include your GPA unless it's specifically called to. I know some more technical fields will ask for that GPA. Of course, then you want to include it. But in all likelihood, especially after you've been in the workforce for several years, nobody is going to care that you had a 3.8 GPA. Secondly, personal interest. This is one I get a lot of questions about, and I think there's a really strategic way to do this. So just listing that you're into sports, photography, volunteerism, and beach vacations. Well, you sound like a great person to like go hang out with at happy hour, but that's not necessarily telling me a lot about you. Like, I like sports, but I'm not necessarily an aficionado, right? I like photography, but nobody's going to commission me for work. This doesn't necessarily tell me anything about your level of involvement in those areas, right? Where I do think you could include exactly that language is on your LinkedIn About section. At the very bottom of your LinkedIn About section is where you can say something to the effect of, when I'm not selling paper, you'll find me on the basketball court or shooting images of my cats before I go volunteer after my beach vacation. You can write this kind of a summary of who you are there. That's a great place to add that personal anecdote. What we do want to focus on, though, are a couple things. I mentioned earlier, we're not going to focus on anything more than 15 years of experience. However, if there is something early in your career that is going to be relevant to the work that you're doing now, or that you just want to like nod your head to the work that you've done because it showcases a fuller picture of you as a professional, you can include an early career snapshot that says, hey, this is what the early years of my career look like. You don't need to include dates. You don't need to include a full scope of everything you've done, but it is a nice way to kind of tip your hat to those early years of your career and to maybe tell a broader story. For example, I had a client a couple years ago who said, Liz, I really want to get into a bigger company. I've been working for small startups for a really long time, and I want to go to a bigger company. Well, 20 years ago, he had worked for a little company called Yahoo. So it was something that was really helpful to have in that early career snapshot because it put a more prominent name on his resume, right? Because at the time, that company was a little bit more of a baby startup, right? But just seeing that name now had the notoriety of like, okay, the things he's done, the places he's been have actually succeeded, and he knows how to work with those larger companies, even though it was still a startup at the time. When it comes to additional involvement, instead of just saying, hey, I'm into sports, instead show that you ran a marathon or that you are on the committee or judge panel for a youth sports foundation, or that you serve on the board for a national park, or whatever it is that you volunteer for your kids' PTA, whatever it is, proving your interest, proving your hobbies through how you've made an impact with them, can do the same thing of just listing. It can do a lot more, for that matter, of just listing those personal interests. Here's our before. Here's what Pam looked like before. You see our objective statement, the soft skills, ton of extra white space. She's got her full address. Nothing that really brands her to what she's trying to target, right? And here's our after. We are still on a 2-page resume, but now we have a much better view of who she is as a professional right up front. We have impact-focused bullets that align directly with the role. We have a little bit of an idea of where she started her career, and we know more about her as a professional outside of work. Okay, so there's our before and after. And before we wrap up for today, I just want to give you kind of a final checklist. If you do nothing else when you're preparing your applications, make sure that you are always, always, always researching the job description and beyond. Don't just look at that, 2 sheets of paper that tell you about that specific role. Go to the website, go to their LinkedIn business page. Side note, what we are seeing is that LinkedIn Recruiter actually has a feature where recruiters can filter out individuals who show interest in their company, and not just those that have clicked follow, but have gone to their business page or have interacted with their content in some way. So if you're interested in the company, be checking them out and taking note of what they're doing on LinkedIn. But definitely always be researching the job description and beyond. Back up everything that you say in your summary. There should be nothing in that introduction that isn't represented in your professional experience somewhere. If you have a bullet in your core competencies that has a skill set in it, you better believe you better have an accomplishment in there that says what it is or how it is that you have developed an expertise in that. Even if it is something as easy as relevant coursework early in your career, that still counts, okay? Using the same language as the company. So if the company is talking about its customers and you're spending your whole resume talking about your clients, that's a very nuanced difference But it's a big difference when it comes to an applicant tracking system, because an applicant tracking system isn't going to be able to tell the difference between those two words. I've actually seen a client make that one small adjustment and had them go from getting absolutely no responses to, consistently being sought after for interviews, just by making that one small adjustment from client to customer. Finding ways to highlight transferable skills, very similarly to what I just said, client versus customer, but also being able to look and say, okay, how did I make an impact in this different way? It's okay to rethink what you thought of as the accomplishment and to start to reposition it if you're searching for a pivot in your career. Always seek feedback. Don't be the only eyes that land on your resume before you submit. Friend, colleague, reach out to Liz, whomever. Make sure that you always have a second set of eyes on your resume before you submit, because we get very lost in that document and it is easy to miss things. And you want to say, hey, is there anything that I've missed? Or worked with people that you've worked with in the past. Hey, we worked on this project together. Is there anything else you can think of? Right. And lastly, in today's market, don't just rely on the strength of your resume. Seek introductions. Be looking for people who can make introductions to decision makers at the companies that you are targeting. Because with where we're at in the job market, companies are seeing anywhere between 250 to upwards of 300 plus applications for roles across the level of contribution. And you don't want to feel like a needle in the haystack. Having a human introduction is going to wildly improve your chances. All right. So as we wrap up today, I just wanted to thank you all for your time. I am Liz with Career Transformation Partners. I want you to join us next month on June 7th, where we're going to talk informational interviews. So for those of you joining us live, we're going to open it up to the Q&A section. Those of us watching on the replay, make sure to click the link below to sign up for June. Thank you so much.